Rome in 38 CE didn't just look invincible. To the known world, it felt eternal. If you were a merchant arriving from the dust of Syria or a diplomat from the mist-shrouded tribes of Gaul, the first sight of the capital would have brought you to your knees. The legions marched with a synchronized thunder that shook the ground, their lorica segmentata armor gleaming like a river of polished steel under the Mediterranean sun. The forums buzzed with the polyglot energy of 1,000 conquered nations, a cacophony of commerce and law. Senators in robes of blinding white, bordered with the crimson stripe of power, debated beneath marble colonnades that seemed to hold up the sky itself. Everything appeared ordered, magnificent, divine. The empire stretched its iron limbs from the freezing rain of Britain to the baking mud of Mesopotamia. Its borders held firm against the barbarian dark. Its wealth flowed like blood through a living body, gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, spices from the east pumping life into the beating heart of the world. To the observer standing in the Forum Romanum, surrounded by temples clad in gold and statues that looked ready to draw breath, Rome was more than a city. It was a monument to human civilization itself. But appearances in Rome were the most dangerous lies of all. Behind the towering palace doors on the Palatine Hill, beneath the gilded ceilings and the frescoes of gods, something was rotting from the inside. The marble was white, but the foundation was soaked in old blood. The empire was still trembling from the reign of Caligula, a madman who had turned the imperial court into a slaughterhouse and a theater of cruelty. Though he was gone, the psychological scars remained etched into the walls of the palace. The air in the imperial corridors still felt heavy, thick with the memory of purges and the lingering scent of fear. It was into this atmosphere of bruised magnificence that a 5-year-old girl walked that year. Her name was Valeria Messalina. She was not a conqueror. She carried no sword, commanded no legion, and held no office. She was a pawn, a beautiful, terrifyingly young piece, moved across the chessboard of Roman politics by men who thought they understood the game. She was supposed to be a solution, a living bandage applied to a gaping wound. Rome needed stability. It needed to believe that the madness of the past few years was over. And so, the power brokers chose her, a young bride to stabilize an aging, stuttering emperor named Claudius. She was intended to be a vessel of virtue to heal a dynasty still scarred by insanity. The Senate praised the match with a relief that bordered on desperation. Priests sacrificed white oxen and blessed the union, reading favorable omens in the entrails. Citizens celebrated in the winding streets, believing that fertility and noble blood would restore dignity to the throne. They looked at her young, with skin like alabaster and eyes that held the spark of the great Julian line, and they saw hope. They saw the Matrona, the ideal Roman mother who would birth a new generation of sanity. History, however, would remember her very differently. The girl who stepped across the threshold of the imperial palace was not the savior they prayed for. She was the spark that would ignite a fire hotter than any Rome had ever known. This is the story of how an empress turned Rome's greatest strength, its rigid moral code, its obsession with power, its paralyzing fear of scandal into a weapon so devastating that the empire's most powerful men found themselves trapped not by armies, but by shame. Before empires crumble under siege, they often decay from within. Before the barbarians smash the gates, the rot begins at the dinner table, in the whisper networks, and in the bedrooms of the elite. Messalina didn't need legions. She didn't need the Senate's permission. She had something far more effective: the terrifying ability to see what men feared most, and the iron will to weaponize it. If you are fascinated by the moments when history reveals its darker face, when the golden mask slips to reveal the skull beneath, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I am genuinely curious to know how far these stories travel. Now, let's step back into the world of ancient Rome. Let's walk past the guards and into the shadows, where an empress learned that control could be bought with humiliation, and that the fall of the greatest empire might begin not on a battlefield, but in a bedroom. This is the story of Messalina, the woman Rome tried to erase from history, and the scandal that whispered the empire's final warning. The public saw exactly what Rome wanted them to see. They saw a beautiful woman of impeccable, noble blood, a descendant of the great Augustus himself. She had pale skin that seemed never to have touched the sun, golden hair that caught the light of the torches, and the kind of face that commanded attention without speaking a word. She did everything that was asked of her. She bore Claudius' children a son, Britannicus, and a daughter, Octavia, quickly and without complication, fulfilling the primary duty of her station. She appeared at state functions with practiced grace, sitting silently beside her husband, her expression a mask of serene devotion. She maintained the rituals of respectability with the precision of an actress who has memorized her lines perfectly. She wove wool, she prayed to Juno, she averted her gaze when appropriate. By every measure Rome applied to women, she was the ideal consort. She was the perfect matrona, the virtuous wife, the embodiment of everything the empire demanded from a woman of her station. She was the living symbol of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But what if perfection was the disguise? What if the silence of the palace was not peace, but a cage? Rome was a city of distinct worlds. There was the Rome of the Palatine, of cool marble and quiet power. But down the hill, in the valleys where the shadows lengthened early, lay a different city. The whispers started there, in the darker corners, in the tenements of the Subura district, where the air smelled of garlic, sweat, and cheap lamp oil. They began in the servants' quarters of noble homes, passed along by slaves who sought everything but were treated as furniture. They drifted into the barracks where soldiers drank sour wine and spoke truths they'd never utter in daylight. The rumors moved like water finding cracks in a dam impossible to stop, spreading through Rome's lowest and highest reaches alike. At first, they were dismissed as the jealous gossip of the lower classes. How could the empress, the cousin of gods, be involved in filth? But the stories grew more elaborate with each telling. They spoke of a figure slipping from the palace at night, not surrounded by guards, but alone, not to visit a lover in secret, not to pray at a clandestine shrine, but to disappear entirely into another life. These whispers claimed that the woman who sat so regally beside Claudius during the day was shedding her imperial skin when the sun went down. They claimed she moved through Rome's red light district like a phantom, her face hidden beneath cheap paint and grease, deliberately applied not to beautify, but to obscure her noble features. They said she wasn't just observing the vice of the city, she was participating in it. And not as a patron, but as a worker. The idea was so absurd, so contradictory to the Roman sense of order, that it took on the weight of a myth. A noble woman, let alone an empress, offering her body in the very brothels that Rome's elite pretended not to visit? It was unthinkable. And yet, the rumors refused to die. They grew louder, feeding on the city's hunger for scandal, suggesting that Messalina was competing directly with the professional women of the Subura. Those who somehow recognized her in the dim, flickering light of the oil lamps faced a terrible choice: silence or ruin. To speak her name in such a place was to invite death. To stay silent was to become complicit in a secret that could tear the empire apart. But this wasn't desperation. It wasn't poverty or madness or the thrashing of a caged woman seeking escape from an unbearable life. It was something colder, something far more calculated. It was a deliberate exploration of everything Rome forbade her to be. To understand the monster, we must first understand the girl she was forced to bury. We have to look past the scandalous headlines of history and step into the suffocating silence of her daily life before the madness began. Rome asked a question that terrified its patriarchs. What happens when the cage is made of gold, but it is still a cage? To find the answer, we must go back to the moment the heavy bronze doors of the Palatine closed behind her, shutting out the sun and sealing her fate. Messalina was born into the very apex of the Roman world, a realm where bloodlines mattered more than happiness, and where marriage was never a union of hearts, but a treaty between families. When she was betrothed to Claudius, she was a vibrant, pulsing creature of 15, standing on the precipice of womanhood, filled with the restless energy of youth. Claudius was 50. He was a man in the winter of his life, a relic of a bygone era who had survived the murderous purges of his family by making himself invisible. To the Senate, Claudius was a safe pair of hands. To the historians, he was an intellectual, a historian, a man of hidden depths. But to a teenage girl forced into his bed, he was a nightmare. Imagine the visceral reality of that union. Claudius was not just older. He was physically marred by illness. He walked with a dragging limp that echoed in the long marble corridors. When he became excited or stressed, his head would twitch uncontrollably, and his speech would fracture into a wet, incomprehensible stammer. He drooled when he laughed. He was a man who preferred the company of dusty scrolls and dead languages to the vibrancy of living people. For a girl raised on stories of heroes and gods, of Aeneas and Achilles, looking at her husband must have felt like looking at death itself. Yet, she had no choice. In Rome, a daughter was a currency to be spent, and Messalina was the highest denomination coin in the vault. She performed her duty with a discipline that was almost frightening. She did not weep in public. She did not flee. She walked down the aisle, accepted the sacred fire, and submitted to the embrace of a man who trembled not with passion, but with palsy. In quick succession, she gave him what he needed most: heirs. She bore a daughter, Octavia, and a son, Britannicus. With these births, she solidified Claudius' shaky claim to the throne. A sterile emperor is a vulnerable emperor, but a father is the patriarch of a dynasty. Messalina had done her job. She had secured the succession. She had bought her safety with her body. To the outside world, she became the living avatar of pudicitia, the uniquely Roman concept of female modesty and sexual integrity. It was a virtue that Rome cherished above all others in its women. A matrona, a high-born mother, was expected to be a pillar of moral fortitude. She was expected to manage the household, oversee the slaves, weave wool for her husbands, togas, a symbolic act connecting her to the legendary wives of the early republic, and, above all, to be invisible. Her influence was supposed to be silent, her desires non-existent. She was an ornament of state, a beautiful statue to be admired but never heard. Messalina played this role to perfection. She sat at the games, her face impassive as gladiators bled into the sand. She attended the sacrifices, her head covered in the veil of piety, while smoke from burnt offerings choked the air. She accepted the adoration of the crowds, who cheered Ave Imperatrix with a demure smile. But beneath the layers of expensive silk and the weight of the imperial jewelry, a terrible pressure was building. The palace on the Palatine was vast, cold, and echoing. It was a place haunted by the ghosts of the past. The walls had seen Tiberius' cruelty and Caligula's madness. The servants moved like shadows, their eyes always lowered, their ears always open. It was a world of whispers and paranoia, where a wrong word could mean exile or execution. And, for Messalina, it was boring. It was excruciatingly, mind-numbingly boring. Claudius was often away, lost in his administrative reforms or buried in the archives, writing histories that few would ever read. When he was present, he was often exhausted or distracted, his mind occupied by the governance of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. He treated Messalina with a kind of grandfatherly affection, perhaps unaware that affection was not what a young woman of her temperament craved. He gave her honors, he gave her wealth, he gave her titles, he gave her everything except what she actually needed: a sense of life. She was surrounded by luxury that would make a modern billionaire weep. She dined on peacock tongues and drank wine cooled with snow brought down from the mountains by runners. She slept on sheets of the finest Egyptian linen, but none of it satisfied her. In fact, the luxury became a form of torture. It was a constant reminder of her entrapment. Every jewel was a link in a chain, every servant was a guard. She realized with a dawning horror that this was it. This was her life until the day she died. She would sit, she would smile, she would weave, and she would slowly turn into stone like the statues that lined the atrium. The contrast between her internal world and her external reality began to tear her apart. Inside, she was a firestorm of energy, intelligence, and a dark, undefined hunger. Outside, she was the Ice Queen. The more the Empire idolized her purity in the daylight, the more suffocating the pedestal became. They worshipped a woman who didn't exist. They prayed to a mask. And slowly, a dangerous thought began to take root in the fertile soil of her boredom. It started not with an act, but with a realization. She realized that the rules of Rome were not laws of nature. They were agreements of men. They were stories people told themselves to keep the darkness at bay. She saw the hypocrisy of the men around her, the senators who lectured on morality in the Senate House during the day, then debauched themselves with slaves at night. She saw the generals who spoke of honor but stabbed their rivals in the back. She saw that Rome was a theater, and everyone was wearing a mask. If everyone was pretending, why shouldn't she? This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was an existential crisis occurring in the mind of a woman with absolute power. She began to test the boundaries of her cage. At first, it was small things: a lingering look at a handsome guard, a private conversation that lasted too long, a command given to a servant that was slightly too cruel or too intimate. She watched for the lightning bolt from Jupiter to strike her down. It never came. She pushed harder. She realized that the fear everyone had of her husband's position protected her. People were terrified to correct the Empress. They were terrified to see what she was doing. They looked away. This looking away was the key. It was the crack in the wall she had been searching for. She discovered that being the wife of the emperor didn't just give her status. It gave her a cloak of invisibility. Because she was the symbol of virtue, no one dared to accuse her of vice. The very rigidity of Roman morality became her shield. Who would believe that the Matrona was slipping out? Who would dare to voice the suspicion? The silence of the palace, once her prison, became her accomplice. The long nights, while Claudius slept the heavy sleep of the old and the medicated, became her playground. She began to feel a thrill that no state banquet could provide, the thrill of the secret, the adrenaline of the forbidden. She wasn't just looking for pleasure. She was looking for agency. In a world that told her she was property, she wanted to prove ownership of herself. And the most radical way to prove she owned her body was to use it in ways that would make the ancestors scream from their tombs. The psychological pivot had happened. The innocent girl who had walked into the palace was gone, consumed by the stifling weight of the golden cage. In her place, something else was waking up. A woman who looked at the sleeping form of the emperor not with fear, but with contempt. A woman who looked at the city of Rome not as a kingdom to be ruled, but as a game to be played. She stood on the balcony of the palace, looking down at the flickering lights of the city below, towards the Subura, where the drums beat and the wine flowed and life was raw and dirty and real. She was done with the marble. She wanted the mud. Rome was a city that defied gravity in more ways than one. While the Palatine Hill floated above the world in a cloud of marble and perfume, the valley below was a festering, churning ocean of humanity known as the Subura. If the Palatine was the brain of the empire, cold and calculating, the Subura was its stomach, acidic, dark, and constantly digesting. It was a labyrinth of towering, rickety tenement blocks, called insulae, that blocked out the sun. Alleyways so narrow that a man could touch both walls with outstretched arms, and air so thick with the stench of garlic, unwashed bodies, and open sewers that it felt solid in the lungs. To a patrician like Messalina, the Subura was supposed to be a place of nightmares. It was where the poor lived and died, often in the same room. It was where the gangs ruled, where knives flashed in the moonlight, and where life was cheap. No woman of noble blood would ever set foot there, not even with a full guard detail. It was social suicide. It was physical danger. But for Messalina, looking down from her gilded cage, the Subura didn't look like hell. It looked like freedom. The descent began in the boudoir, the private dressing room where the empress was usually adorned in the regalia of state. But on these nights, the ritual was inverted. Instead of the stola, the long, modest dress of the Roman matron that covered a woman from neck to ankle, she chose a rough tunic of coarse wool, the kind worn by fishwives and slaves. She stripped off the jewels, the emeralds from Scythia, the pearls from the Red Sea, and placed them in a box of cedar wood. But the transformation required more than a change of clothes. It required a change of skin. She sat before her polished bronze mirror, but she was not looking to enhance her beauty. She was looking to erase it. She took a heavy pot of mixture ashes and cheap fat and smeared it over her eyelids, darkening them into the heavy, garish gaze of a streetwalker. She rouged her cheeks not with the subtle blush of a lady, but with the crimson paint of a woman who advertises her wares. And then came the final, most damning piece of the disguise: the wig. Roman society had a complex language of hair. Dark hair was the sign of Roman purity, of genetic heritage. Blonde hair was the mark of the barbarian, the German, the Gaul, the conquered. By extension, it became the trademark of the prostitute, the woman who was outside the bounds of respectable society. Messalina pulled a wig of yellow hair, coarse and glaringly bright, over her own noble locks. In the mirror, Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, vanished. In her place stood Lysiska, the wolf girl. This was the name she would whisper in the dark. It was a name that stripped her of her ancestors, her titles, and her obligations. Lysiska had no father to please, no husband to honor, no empire to represent. Lysiska was nobody, and therefore, she could do anything. How did she leave? The palace was a fortress, guarded by the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor with their lives. Yet, history tells us she slipped out. Perhaps she used the service tunnels that honeycombed the hill, designed for slaves to move unseen. Perhaps she bribed a specific gatekeeper, a man whose silence was bought with gold or fear. Or perhaps she simply walked out with the confidence of someone who knows that people see what they expect to see. A guard looking for an empress does not see a common whore huddled in a cloak. Invisibility lies in the unexpected. Stepping out of the palace grounds and into the city streets must have been a physical shock. The temperature changed. The Palatine was cool and breezy. The streets below retained the heat of the day, radiating from the cobblestones like an oven. And the noise Rome at night was illegal for wagons during the day, so the darkness was filled with the rumble of wheels, the cracking of whips, the shouting of drovers, and the drunken songs spilling from taverns. She moved through the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with an intoxicating rush of adrenaline. For the first time in her life, she was walking without a retinue. No lictors cleared the path for her. No slaves carried her litter. She was jostled by drunkards, brushed against by laborers covered in dust. The physical contact with the plebs, the common mob, was electric. Every step was a transgression. Every breath of foul air was a rejection of the sterile incense of the palace. She was descending into the gut of the beast. Her destination was a lupanar, literally wolf's den, the Roman word for a brothel. These were not the high-end establishments where Greek courtesans played the lyre and recited poetry. This was a stall in the Suburra, a place of hard commerce. The structure was cramped, smelling of sour wine and bodily fluids. Small rooms, or cellae, lined a narrow corridor, each closed off by nothing more than a curtain or a flimsy wooden door. Above the doors were paintings graphic, crude frescoes depicting the specialties of the woman inside. Messalina did not go there to watch. She went there to work. It is almost impossible for the modern mind to fully grasp the magnitude of this act. This was not Marie Antoinette playing at being a shepherdess in a clean, manicured garden. This was the Queen of England working a shift in a Victorian dockside tavern. Messalina took a room. She stood in the doorway, the yellow wig catching the flickering light of the oil lamps. And she waited. She waited for men who smelled of the tannery and the forge. She waited for soldiers who had no idea that the body they were buying belonged to the woman whose face was stamped on the coins in their purse. She demanded payment. A few copper asses, the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. She took the coins, their cold metal biting into her palm, and she felt a satisfaction that the treasury of Rome had never given her. This money was real. It was earned. It was a transaction where she was the seller, not the sold. In the palace, she was Claudius' property. Here, for the duration of the act, she was the master of the moment. She discovered a terrifying truth in that dark, cramped cell. There is a strange, absolute power in total degradation. When you have abandoned all dignity, you have nothing left to lose, and that makes you dangerous. But secrets in Rome were like water. They always found a way to leak out. The whispers began in the transition zones, the places where the high world met the low. It started with the laundry slaves. They noticed the smell of the empress clothes in the morning, not the scent of lavender and rose, but the deep, clinging odors of cheap smoke, sweat, and sex. They saw the yellow wig hidden hastily in a chest. They saw the exhaustion in her eyes when she appeared for the morning greeting, the way she winced at the bright sunlight. The she-wolf walks at night. A servant might whisper to a cook while plucking a goose. I saw a figure at the postern gate. A guard might mutter to his comrade on the wall. Walked like a queen, dressed like a whore. At first the rumors were fragmented, confused. People couldn't reconcile the images. The cognitive dissonance was too great. But the stories persisted because the details were too specific to be invented. They spoke of a woman with the empress golden eyes who laughed too loud in the taverns. They spoke of a prostitute in the Suburra who knew the intimate habits of the court, who mocked the senators by name. The rumors moved from the slave quarters to the barracks of the Praetorian Guard. Soldiers are gossips. They see everything and say nothing to their officers, but they tell each other everything. They began to place bets. They began to watch. The protective bubble of divinity that surrounded the empress was beginning to thin. The respect was being replaced by a leering curiosity. Messalina must have known the risks. She must have seen the way her maids looked at her, the way the guards exchanged glances when she passed. But the addiction was already set. The shadows of the Suburra had claimed her. She had tasted the drug of anonymity, the violent thrill of living two lives, and she couldn't stop. The marble palace felt colder every morning, and the filth of the streets felt warmer every night. She was playing a game of Russian roulette with the fate of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Every night she went out, she risked being recognized by a senator, a rival, or a spy. Discovery meant death not just for her, but likely for Claudius too. For a man who cannot control his wife cannot control the world. But she didn't care. Or perhaps, deep down, the danger was the point. She was standing on the edge of the abyss, staring down into the darkness of Rome's underbelly, and to her horror and delight, she found that the darkness was staring back, and it was smiling. In the damp, flickering shadows of the Subura, names were the first things to be discarded. No one asked who you were, only what you cost. Above the narrow wooden door of the cell Messalina claimed as her own, a crude placard a titulus was hung. It did not bear the name Valeria, nor the title Augusta. It bore a single name, scratched in charcoal or painted in rough red lead: Lysiska, the wolf girl. To the modern ear, it sounds almost playful. To a Roman, it was a label dripping with bestial connotation. Wolves were creatures of appetite, of violence, of the wild places beyond the firelight. By choosing this name, the Empress of Rome was not just hiding her identity, she was shedding her humanity. She was stepping out of the orderly world of laws and into the primal world of instinct. Inside the cella, the space was claustrophobic. These rooms were stone boxes, barely wide enough for a bed, designed for efficiency, not comfort. The air was heavy with the smell of olive oil from the sputtering lamps, a scent that the poet Juvenal would later write, soaked into her skin so deeply that she carried the stink of the brothel back to the imperial pillow. But for Messalina, this suffocating atmosphere was the air of liberation. She stood in the doorway, her body displayed against the backdrop of the rough stone walls, her nipples gilded with gold leaf a touch of the palace. She couldn't resist bringing into the gutter, and her face masked by the heavy makeup and the blonde wig. She competed directly with the professional women of the district. These were women for whom this life was a sentence, often slaves or desperate freedwomen trying to buy their next meal. Messalina, who owned estates in Egypt and vineyards in Tuscany, stood shoulder to shoulder with them, fighting for the attention of the dregs of the city. Why? This is the question that echoes through the centuries. Why would a woman who could command any lover in the empire, who could summon the most beautiful actors, gladiators, or nobles to her private chambers, choose this? The answer lies in the nature of the transaction. In the palace, every interaction was laden with politics. If she slept with a senator, it was a political alliance. If she slept with a guard, it was a dangerous leverage. Even with her husband, sex was a duty, a means to produce heirs. But here, in the filth of the Lupanar, the transaction was brutally simple. It was honest. Men came to her not because she was the empress, but because she was a body. They didn't fear her. They didn't revere her. They used her. And in that usage, she found a twisted form of agency. She demanded payment of few copper asses, the smallest denomination of Roman currency. She would take the coins from the rough hands of sailors and laborers, men with dirt under their fingernails and wine on their breath. Historians recount that she was obsessive about this payment. She didn't need the money. She likely left it there or threw it into the gutter on her way back. But the act of being paid was the ritual. It was the proof that she was Lysiska, not Messalina. It was the proof that for a few hours, she was not a symbol of the state, but a creature of flesh and blood, valued only for what she could physically provide. It was a rebellion against the abstract nature of her power. In the brothel, power was physical, immediate, and raw. But she was not alone in this madness. We must consider the terrifying logistics of her descent. An empress does not simply disappear. She was surrounded by a web of attendants, maids, and guards. How did she keep them silent? She corrupted them. This was the second layer of her transgression. She didn't just fall. She dragged her household down with her. The maids who helped her apply the grease paint, the servants who procured the wig, the guards who stood watch not to protect the empress but to protect the whore, they were all complicit. She bound them to her with a chain forged of fear and shared guilt. Imagine the terror of a Praetorian guard stationed outside a cheap brothel in the Subura. His duty is to protect the life of the empress. But inside, that empress is willingly submitting to the lowest men in Rome. If he intervenes, he disobeys her direct command. If he stays silent, he is allowing the dignity of Rome to be defiled. If he reports her, he risks being executed for spreading lies. Or worse, executed by her for treason before the emperor finds out. Messalina understood this leverage perfectly. She turned her protectors into her prisoners. Their silence was bought not with gold, but with the terrifying realization that they were already too deep to get out. They were co-conspirators in the greatest scandal of the age. As the night wore on, the phantom courtesan pushed herself to limits that shocked even the professionals. The brothel keepers, hardened men and women who had seen every depravity Rome had to offer, watched with a mixture of confusion and awe. This new girl, Lysiska, had an endurance that seemed inhuman. She did not tire. She did not refuse. It was as if she was trying to empty herself, to scrub away the identity of the Empress through sheer physical exhaustion. She wasn't just working, she was competing. She watched the other women, the veterans of the trade, and she sought to outdo them. She wanted to be the last one standing. There is a profound narcissism in this, a need to be superior in every environment she entered. On the Palatine, she had to be the most virtuous. In the Subra, she had to be the most insatiable. She could not tolerate being average, even in hell. The night would eventually wane. The noise of the carts would begin to fade as the false dawn turned the sky a bruised purple. The other women, exhausted and broken, would close their doors, retreating into sleep. But the historical accounts, particularly from the scathing pen of Juvenal, paint a haunting picture of Messalina at this hour. She retired, sad. He wrote, sad, not ashamed, not satisfied, sad. Why sadness? Perhaps because the night was over, perhaps because the sun was rising, and with it, the return of the cage. As the first light touched the rooftops, Lysiska had to die so that Messalina could live. She would stand for a moment longer in the doorway, the last to close her cell, clutching the copper coins, her body aching, her skin covered in the grime of the city. The return journey was a race against the sun, back through the waking streets, huddled in her cloak, back up the service tunnels of the Palatine, back into the silent, perfumed rooms of the palace. The transformation had to be reversed instantly. The wig was hidden. The makeup was scrubbed from her skin until her face was raw. The smell of the lamps and the sweat of strangers had to be masked with heavy oils of rose and myrrh. She would slip into the bed of the emperor, often just as he was stirring. She would lie there, feigning sleep, while her heart hammered against her ribs. When Claudius woke, he would see his beautiful young wife, perhaps looking a little tired, perhaps a little pale, but undeniably there. He would kiss her, never tasting the smoke of the brothel on her lips, never knowing that the woman beside him had just lived a lifetime in the dark. But the mask was beginning to slip. You can scrub away the paint, but you cannot scrub away the experience. The eyes that looked out at the Senate later that morning were different. They were harder. They had seen the underbelly of the men who sat in those marble benches. She looked at a consul and saw not a statesman, but a man with the same hungers as the sailor in the brothel. She looked at a general and saw the same weakness she had exploited for a copper coin. The brothel hadn't just been a playground. It had been a school. Messalina had gone into the dark to escape, but she returned with a weapon. She realized that the high-born men of Rome were no different from the low-born. They were just more expensive. And if she could control the men in the dark with her body, she could control the men in the light with their secrets. The phantom courtesan was fading, but the political predator was just being born. The game was about to change. She wasn't going to go to the brothel anymore. She was going to bring the brothel to the palace. The human mind struggles with contradiction. We want people to be one thing, good or bad, noble or base, virgin or whore, but Messalina had discovered something that would define her entire reign. Something that gave her a terrifying advantage over the rigid men of Rome, the erotic power of contradiction. Rome was a society built on binaries, civilization versus barbarism, man versus woman, master versus slave. These lines were drawn in blood and iron, meant to be uncrossable. Messalina didn't just cross them, she danced on them. She realized that the thrill, the true, heart-stopping ecstasy, didn't come from the sex itself. It came from the vertigo of the drop. It came from the dizzying distance between who she was supposed to be and who she was in the dark. This was the erotic paradox. Consider the scene. It is morning in the Curia. The Senate is in session. Messalina enters the gallery, draped in the heavy, woolen stola of a matrona, her hair bound in the complex, braided style of the imperial court. She walks with a slow, dignified gait. Hundreds of the most powerful men in the known world rise to bow to her. They lower their eyes in respect. To them, she is the mother of the air, the wife of the Caesar, a creature so far above them she might as well be a goddess. But Messalina is watching them with a secret burning in her chest. She knows that just 4 hours ago, she was on her knees in a stone cell. Her name was Lysiska, and she was taking orders from men who wouldn't dare look a senator in the eye. This knowledge was intoxicating. It was a private joke that only she understood. As she nodded graciously to a pompous official lecturing on public morality, she must have felt a surge of adrenaline sharper than any wine. "I am fooling you all," she must have thought. I am the dirt you walk on, and I am the queen you worship. This duality fed a growing hunger. The more the empire idolized her purity in the daylight, the more necessary it became to shatter it in the darkness. It was a cycle of addiction. The higher the pedestal they built for her, the deeper the pit she had to dig to balance it out. The praise of the Senate became the trigger for her nightly descent. When they called her virtuous, she felt a compulsion to prove them wrong that was almost violent in its intensity. But a shift was occurring. The thrill of the anonymous brothel was starting to wear off. The danger of wandering the Subura was immense, yes, but the scale was too small. Messalina was an empress. Her canvas was the world. Why limit herself to the dark corners where no one knew her name? The ultimate thrill, she realized, would not be in hiding who she was, but in forcing the world to accept her corruption while smiling in her face. She began to bring the darkness home. It started slowly. The phantom of the Subura began to manifest in the corridors of the Palatine. She stopped hiding the hunger in her eyes. She began to look at the men of the court, the handsome tribunes, the young senators, the famous actors not as subjects, but as prey. This was a dangerous transition. In the brothel, she was anonymous. Here, everyone knew her. To take a lover in the palace was treason. It was a capital offense. Under the Lex Julia, the ancient laws on adultery established by Augustus, she could be exiled or executed. But Messalina had learned something about fear in the Subura. It paralyzed people. She tested the waters with the silence of her husband. Claudius was increasingly withdrawn, burying himself in his books and his bureaucracy. He was deaf to the rumors, or perhaps he chose not to hear them. His blindness gave her permission. She realized that as long as she maintained the public ritual of the marriage, the private reality could be whatever she wanted. She began to seduce men within the palace orbit. At first, it was the safe targets. The freedmen, the actors, the gladiators, men who had no social standing and thus no power to refuse her. Nestor, the famous pantomime actor, was one of the first. He was a celebrity, adored by the crowds, but socially he was infamia, beneath dignity. Messalina didn't ask him. She commanded him. Stories say she ordered statues of him to be melted down into coins so he could literally be spent by her. But soon, the actors weren't enough. She wanted the aristocrats. She wanted the men who had everything to lose. This was where the erotic paradox weaponized itself. When she approached a senator or a young nobleman, the dynamic was terrifying. He was being propositioned by the empress. If he refused, he insulted her, and she could destroy him with a whisper to Claudius. He looked at me with lust. He plotted against you. If he accepted, he committed treason, and she owned him forever because she held the secret of his crime. It was the perfect trap. The men she targeted were paralyzed by the contradiction. They were caught between their duty to the emperor and their fear of the empress. And Messalina, the hunter, watched them squirm. She enjoyed the hesitation, the terror in their eyes as they realized there was no good choice. She was no longer just a woman seeking pleasure. She was a predator playing with her food. The adrenaline rush of nearly being caught, the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The brush of a curtain became the only thing that made her feel alive. She was turning the imperial palace into a high-stakes theater where she wrote the script, and the genre was horror. The transition was complete. She had moved from a personal vice to a weaponized lifestyle. She was no longer going out to the brothel. She was turning the Roman Empire into one. And the men of Rome, so confident in their laws and their legions, were about to find out that they were defenseless against a woman who had no shame left to lose. By the early 42nd CE, the imperial palace had undergone a metamorphosis. Under Claudius' predecessor, Caligula, the madness had been chaotic random beheadings, horses made into priests, screaming fits of paranoia. But under Messalina, the corruption settled into something far more sophisticated and suffocating. It became a theater of the grotesque, a staged production where the set design was opulence and the script was humiliation. The banquets were the center of this transformation. In the days of Augustus, a state dinner was a somber affair. Men spoke of grain shipments, border skirmishes, and the price of olive oil. The wine was watered down. The mood was serious. But if you walked into the triclinium, the great dining hall under Messalina's reign, you would think you had stepped into a fever dream imagined by Dionysus himself. The sensory assault was deliberate. The air was thick with clouds of saffron mist, sprayed from hidden pipes to mask the smell of excess. The couches were no longer simple wood and wool. They were draped in Tyrian purple silk, a fabric so expensive that a single pound of it cost a soldier's yearly wage. The lighting was low, provided by hundreds of oil lamps scented with nard and cinnamon, creating a golden, flickering haze that blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. And then, there was the food. The banquet tables groaned under the weight of culinary monstrosities, designed to prove the empire's dominance over nature itself. There were peacocks from Samos, their feathers reattached after roasting, so they looked alive on the platter. There were tongues of flamingos, a delicacy prized for its rarity rather than its taste. There were roasted dormice dipped in honey and rolled in poppy seeds. Wine flowed in rivers, Falernian vintage, aged for decades, served not in clay cups but in vessels of crystal and murrhine glass that were worth more than the slaves pouring into them. But the true spectacle was not on the plates. It was on the couches. Messalina turned the banquet into a weaponized social experiment. She invited the pillars of Roman society, the consuls, the praetors, the generals who had conquered Britain and Mauritania. These were men of iron dignity, men who lived by the code of gravitas. They arrived expecting a formal dinner. They found themselves trapped in a performance where the rules of Roman society were inverted. The original script tells us, the banquets no longer celebrated policy or military victory. They became theater, grotesque, suffocating theater. Messalina would preside over the room not as a hostess, but as a director. She commanded the seating arrangements with malicious precision. A senator would be placed next to the man who was suing him. A general would be seated next to the wife he suspected of adultery. And in the center of it all, Messalina orchestrated the flow of wine and conversation. As the night deepened and the wine did its work, the atmosphere would shift. The musicians would play faster, more discordant rhythms. Dancers from Cadiz would enter, twisting their bodies in ways that no Roman matron should ever witness. And then, the empress would begin her game. She would encourage and then command acts of debauchery that shattered the social contract. She forced aristocratic women to perform. This was the breaking point of the evening. In Rome, a noble woman's reputation was her life. To dance, to sing, or to act like a courtesan was social death. Yet, under the gaze of the empress, wives of consuls were coerced into degrading displays. They were made to compete with the slave girls. They were made to kiss, to touch, to expose themselves while their husbands watched, paralyzed by fear. Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they flip the tables and storm out? Because in the Roman court, to refuse the emperor's wife was to insult the emperor, and to insult the emperor was treason. They were hostages to etiquette. Messalina knew that their rigid moral code was actually a set of handcuffs. They were too polite to save themselves. The scenes described by historians are chilling in their psychological violence. Imagine a general, a man who has ordered the deaths of thousands of barbarians, sitting frozen with a cup of wine in his hand, forcing a smile while his wife is humiliated by the empress lover across the table. He cannot draw his sword. He cannot speak. He can only endure. This was the grotesque theater. It was the inversion of power. The men who ruled the world were reduced to voyeurs and victims in a dining room. Messalina stripped them of their armor, not with force, but with atmosphere. She created a space where the norms of the outside world didn't apply, a bubble of depravity where she was the only law, and she watched. That was the most terrifying part. She wasn't just a participant, she was an observer. She watched their eyes. She watched who looked away in shame and who watched with hidden lust. She watched who got angry and who got aroused. She was cataloging their reactions. The banquet was not a party, it was a stress test. She was finding the cracks in the marble facade of the Roman elite. She was identifying the weak, the perverted, the desperate, and the compromised. The wine was truth serum. The debauchery was a filter. By the time the guests stumbled out into the cool night air of the Palatine, dazed and sick with wine and shame, they left something behind. They left their dignity on the floor of the triclinium, and they took something with them. A terrifying secret. They were now complicit. They had seen the empress naked. They had seen their colleagues broken. They had done things that could never be spoken of in the Senate House. They were bound together in a shared shame that became a chain stronger than any lock. Messalina had realized that if she could make everyone guilty, then no one could judge her. If everyone was dirty, then she was clean, or at least, she was safe. She was building a court of accomplices. But there was a deeper purpose to this madness. As the guests tried to wash the memory of the night from their minds, Messalina was already awake, meeting with her scribes. The theater was over. The intelligence gathering was just beginning. Messalina had learned something that Rome's emperors before her, even the cunning Tiberius, had not fully grasped. She understood that information was a weapon more effective than steel. An army can be defeated by a larger army. A law can be overturned by a new decree. But a secret? A secret is a blade that never dulls, and it can be held against a throat forever without drawing a single drop of blood until the moment is right. While the city slept off the excesses of the banquets, Messalina was at work. She transformed her wing of the palace into what we would today recognize as an intelligence agency. Her spies were not hooded figures in dark alleys. They were the invisible people of Rome, the cupbearers who refilled the wine while senators whispered, the body slaves who dressed the wives of generals, the bath attendants who heard the unguarded conversations of naked men. Every morning, reports filtered back to her. She didn't want to know about troop movements or grain prices. She wanted the dirt. She wanted to know which senator was drowning in gambling debts. She wanted to know which tribune preferred young boys to his wife. She wanted to know who was secretly worshipping foreign gods, who was skimming money from the treasury, and who had whispered a joke about Claudius' stammer. Her loyal attendants, freedmen who owed their lives and fortunes to her, tracked everything. They wrote it down. They cataloged the shame of Rome's elite. This was the web of intelligence, and she used it to twist the Roman state by invisible hands. Consider the mechanics of her power. A governorship in a wealthy province like Asia or Africa was the ultimate prize for a Roman aristocrat. It was a chance to plunder a country and return to Rome rich enough to buy the Senate. Typically, these posts were assigned by lot or by the emperor's favor based on merit and lineage. Under Messalina, the criteria changed. Governors were chosen not for competence, military ability, or administrative skill, but for complicity. When a name came up for promotion, Messalina would check her files. If she found a man who had a secret, she could exploit a man she had compromised at one of her banquets, or a man whose wife she had corrupted, he got the job. Why? Because a compromised man is an obedient man. She didn't want heroes. Heroes are dangerous. They have principles. She wanted cowards. She wanted men who would look at the orders coming from the palace and obey them without question, because they knew that if they hesitated, a scroll containing the details of their private perversions would accidentally find its way to the public courts. Generals remained loyal, not through honor or patriotism or love of Rome, but through terror of exposure. Senators made decisions not based on what was best for the empire, but on what would protect them from the empress' knowledge. The script notes, she ruled not through decree or law, but through knowledge. Every confession whispered in shame, every act performed in degradation, was collected. This period represents the shift from Messalina the hedonist to Messalina the tyrant. The sex was no longer just about her pleasure or her rebellion. It was the mechanism of her administration. She seduced men to extract their secrets. She orchestrated orgies to create blackmail material. There is a terrifying story of a senator named Valerius Asiaticus. He was immensely rich, powerful, and respected. Messalina coveted his sprawling gardens, the gardens of Lucullus, which were the most beautiful in Rome. She didn't offer to buy them. She didn't ask Claudius to seize them legally. Instead, she used her web. She found a man named Suilius, a prosecutor known for his viciousness, and she fed him information. She accused Asiaticus of adultery and treason charges she manufactured based on the whispers she had collected. The trial was a sham. Asiaticus was cornered. He couldn't defend himself because the evidence was a mixture of lies and humiliating truths about his private life that Messalina threatened to reveal. To save his family from the disgrace of a public execution and confiscation of property, he committed suicide. He opened his veins in those very gardens. Messalina got her property. This was the reality of her web. It was predatory. She was eating the Roman aristocracy from the inside out. And what of Claudius? The emperor was the ultimate beneficiary and the ultimate victim of this system. On paper, his reign was stable. The Senate passed his laws. The provinces were quiet. But this stability was artificial. It was bought with the silence of terrified men. Claudius believed he was beloved. In reality, he was being managed. Messalina filtered the world before it reached him. She decided who could see him, what petitions he read, and which rumors reached his ears. She had constructed a shadow government. The Senate debated, the consuls marched, the lictors carried the fasces, but the real decisions were made in Messalina's chambers, often over a cup of wine, while she reviewed the list of who owed her their silence. But blackmail is a dangerous foundation for an empire. It works perfectly until it breaks. You can push a man to give you his money, his vote, even his dignity. But if you push him too far, if you take everything he has, he loses his fear. A man with nothing left to lose is the only thing more dangerous than an empress with a secret. Messalina, drunk on her own success, began to forget this. She thought the web was unbreakable. She thought she could trap the entire world. She was about to escalate her operations from the political to the industrial. She was about to build a monument to her control, a place where the pretense of banquets would be dropped entirely. The time for subtle manipulation was ending. The time for the villa was beginning. As the years passed, the confines of the Palatine Palace, vast as they were, became too small for Messalina's ambition. The palace was still, technically, the emperor's house. There were protocols there, guards who answered to the tribune, ancient traditions that hung in the air like dust. She needed a space that was entirely her own, a domain where the laws of Rome did not just bend, but broke completely. And so, she created the villa. This was not a dingy room in the Suburra. That phase of her life, the Lysiska phase, had been a solitary rebellion. This was something far more organized and terrifying. She established a base of operations in a lavish villa near the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. To the public eye, it appeared to be just another elegant residence of an aristocratic family, perhaps a place for summer retreats or garden parties. It had high walls covered in ivy, statues of nymphs pouring water into marble basins, and manicured groves of cypress trees that blocked the view from the street. But inside, it was what historians have called an imperial brothel, hidden in plain sight. This description, however, fails to capture the true horror of the institution. A brothel implies voluntary commerce. You pay, you receive. The villa was a prison of coercion. Messalina turned her gaze to the women of the nobility. She had already humiliated their husbands. Now she came for the wives and daughters. Using the leverage she had built the web of intelligence, she began to issue summons. A messenger would arrive at a senator's home with a sealed scroll. It was an invitation to the villa, but everyone knew it was not a request. Aristocratic women were forced to serve there under threat of ruin. The script tells us, their families destroyed, their names dragged through scandal, their reputations obliterated if they didn't comply. Imagine the scene. A matrona of the Julian or Claudian line, a woman raised to believe her virtue was the spiritual anchor of her family, arriving at the villa. She is ushered not into a reception hall, but into a chamber designed for vice. Messalina is there, waiting. She is not shouting. She is smiling. She explains the terms calmly. The woman is to stay. She is to entertain the guests who will arrive later. If she refuses, Messalina produces a document. Perhaps it is a confession of her husband's embezzlement. Perhaps it is proof of her son's treasonous words. Perhaps it is simply the threat that Messalina will accuse her of adultery, a charge that, coming from the Empress, is a death sentence. The women stayed. They had no choice. The villa became a nightmare factory. By day, it was quiet. By night, it filled with men, senators, generals, wealthy merchants, foreign princes. They arrived under false pretenses, believing they were attending an exclusive private party. They were greeted with wine, music, and the sight of Rome's most respectable women waiting for them in states of undress. The psychological impact on the Roman elite was catastrophic. Rome was a society based on hierarchy and status. A senator does not sleep with a consul's wife unless it is a dangerous affair. A merchant does not touch a noblewoman. But in the villa, all hierarchies were dissolved into a sludge of lust. Messalina forced the social order to cannibalize itself. She made the men complicit in the rape of their own class. When a senator slept with a woman at the villa, he wasn't just committing adultery. He was participating in the empress crime. He was destroying the honor of a fellow aristocrat. This guaranteed his silence. Who could he tell? If he admitted he was there, he admitted to his own depravity. Messalina watched it all. She presided over the villa like a spider in the center of a very expensive web. She didn't always participate. Sometimes, her pleasure came solely from the orchestration. She enjoyed the power of forcing the virtuous to be vile. She enjoyed watching the light die in the eyes of a proud woman. She enjoyed seeing a moralizing politician turn into a beast. The villa was also a financial engine. Later accounts claim she used the knowledge gained here to blackmail entire families into submission, securing wealth without having to ask for it. If a merchant wanted a trade monopoly, he came to the villa. If a senator wanted a trial dismissed, he came to the villa. The currency was shame, and the exchange rate was high. But the most chilling aspect was the bureaucratic precision of it. This wasn't chaotic. It was organized. There were lists. There were schedules. Messalina applied the administrative efficiency of the Roman Empire to the production of depravity. She was running a department of state, and its function was the destruction of souls. The villa stood as a physical manifestation of her philosophy, that everyone is corruptible, that dignity is a lie, and that the only truth is power. But in creating this hell, she was sowing the seeds of a hatred so deep, so visceral, that it would eventually burn her to ash. You can hurt a man's body, and he might forgive you. You can take his money, and he might recover. But if you take his honor, if you force him to destroy the things he holds sacred, he will wait 1,000 years for the chance to kill you. Inside the villa, amidst the moans and the music, the knives were being sharpened in the dark. If the villa was a theater of depravity, the ticket price was the soul of the Roman state. We often think of corruption in ancient Rome as bags of gold changing hands in dark alleys, or bribes paid to praetorian prefects. But Messalina introduced a new currency to the imperial economy: shame. And unlike gold, which can be spent and lost, shame creates a debt that can never be fully repaid. The mechanics of this shadow government were brutally efficient. Messalina had realized that simply taxing the provinces or confiscating estates was crude. It angered the people and alerted the Senate. But if you could force the wealthiest men in the empire to give you their fortunes willingly, silently, desperately, you could drain the empire dry without ever passing a tax law. The process began with the invitation. Imagine a wealthy merchant from Ostia, a man who controls the grain shipments that feed the city. He receives a summons to the villa near the Campus Martius. He believes he is being honored. Perhaps the empress wants to discuss a contract? Perhaps he is finally being recognized for his service? He arrives in his finest toga, his slaves carrying gifts. He enters the atrium, expecting a reception. Instead, he finds a nightmare. He is ushered into a room where the air smells of heavy incense and sweat. He sees a senator he recognizes a man of high standing weeping in a corner, while a woman who looks suspiciously like a consul's wife pours wine on his head. Before the merchant can retreat, the doors close. Messalina appears. She doesn't want to discuss grain. She wants to play. The entrapment was total. Once inside the villa, the merchant was compromised simply by being there. But Messalina ensured the hook was set deep. He would be coerced into acts perhaps with a noblewoman who was also being blackmailed, binding them together in a pact of mutual destruction, or he would be drugged and placed in compromising positions. And all the while, the eyes of her agents were watching. The details were recorded. The next morning, the bill arrived. It wasn't an invoice. It was a request. The Empress desires a donation to the Temple of Venus, or the Empress suggests that the contract for the Egyptian grain fleet be awarded to her designated freedman. The merchant paid. He paid instantly. He paid whatever she asked, because the alternative was the destruction of his entire life. If he refused, the story of what happened at the villa would leak. His wife would leave him. His business partners would abandon him. He might be prosecuted for corrupting a noblewoman, a charge that carried the death penalty, even though he had been the victim. This was the economics of shame. Messalina was selling safety from the very danger she created. But the corruption went deeper than mere extortion. She began to sell the administration of the empire itself. Rome was a bureaucratic machine. It needed governors, prefects, judges, and tax collectors. Traditionally, these roles went to men of merit or high birth. Under Messalina, the offices of state were put up for auction in the bedrooms of the villa. Historians like Cassius Dio and Suetonius hint at the sheer scale of this trafficking. Citizenship, the most prized possession in the ancient world, the key to legal protection and social status, was sold like vegetables in a market. At first, the price was high, but as Messalina's greed grew, the price dropped. It was said that eventually, one could become a Roman citizen for the price of a few shards of broken glass. Governorships were the most lucrative items on the menu. A man who wanted to rule Syria or Judea didn't need military experience anymore. He needed to please the empress. There are accounts of obscure, incompetent men suddenly rising to high office, baffling the public. Why was he chosen? The Senate whispered. The legions grumbled. But only the visitors to the villa knew the truth. He was chosen because he was compromised. Messalina preferred these compromised men. A competent governor might develop a conscience. A competent general might become a rival. But a man who owed his position to a dirty secret? He was a puppet. He would tax his province ruthlessly to send a cut back to Messalina. He would sign any execution order she sent him. He was owned. Consider the case of a reconstructed figure. Let's call him Marcus. Marcus is a minor aristocrat with no military history and a mountain of gambling debt. He attends the villa. He performs. He is recorded. A week later, a decree arrives from the palace, signed by the shaking hand of Claudius but drafted by Messalina's scribes. Marcus is named proconsul of Asia. The Senate is outraged. He is a fool, they cry. He knows nothing of administration. But the decree stands. Marcus goes to Asia. He plunders the temples to pay off his debts. He sends chests of silver back to Messalina's private treasury. And when the people of Asia complain, their petitions are intercepted by Messalina's spies before they ever reach Claudius. Marcus is safe, Rome is poorer, and Messalina is richer. This was how she built a fortune that rivaled the state treasury. She didn't just want luxury, she wanted independence. She was stockpiling wealth as if preparing for a war. And in a sense, she was. She knew that Claudius would not live forever. She knew that her son, Britannicus, would need vast resources to hold the throne against rivals. Or perhaps, more darkly, she was preparing for a future where she didn't need Claudius at all. The villa became the de facto capital of Rome. The Palatine was where the emperor signed papers. The villa was where the deals were made. The shadow government functioned with terrifying smoothness. Senators stopped debating in the Curia because they knew the votes were already decided in the Empress bed. Laws were passed not for the good of the res publica, but to cover the tracks of the villa's guests. But an economy based on blackmail has a flaw. It creates inflation of hatred. Every man who paid Messalina didn't just lose gold. He gained resentment. Every governor who was forced to humiliate himself to get a promotion nurtured a burning desire for revenge. The loyalty she bought was brittle. It looked solid from the outside, but one sharp blow would shatter it into 1,000 shards of glass. Messalina, blinded by the flow of gold and the rush of power, failed to see this. She looked at the men surrounding her, smiling, bowing, offering gifts, and she saw obedient subjects. She didn't see that she was surrounded by men who were mentally rehearsing her murder. She had turned the Roman elite into a powder keg, and with every new act of extortion, she was adding another grain of gunpowder. All it would take was a spark, and the spark would come not from the merchants or the politicians, but from the one group she had dangerously underestimated: the men with swords. The Roman Empire was not built on gold, nor on laws, nor on marble. It was built on steel. The legions were the spine of the world, the terrifying engine that had crushed Carthage, subdued Gaul, and brought the East to its knees. At the heart of this military machine lay a concept that was almost religious in its intensity: virtus. Virtus is a word that translates poorly into modern English. It means manliness, but it also means courage, honor, discipline, and a stoic endurance of pain. It was the code that allowed a Roman soldier to stand his ground while a barbarian horde charged at him screaming. It was the belief that a man's dignity was worth more than his life. Death before dishonor was not a slogan. It was a biological imperative for the Roman officer class. Messalina took this code and defiled it. She had broken the senators, the merchants, and the wives. But her hunger for dominance demanded that she break the strongest. She wanted to see Virtus kneel. She turned her eyes toward the generals, the legati who commanded legions, the men whose names were whispered with fear by the enemies of Rome. The invitation to the villa for a soldier was a trap of a different kind. A merchant might be blackmailed with financial ruin. A soldier could only be broken by the destruction of his honor. Imagine a tribune, a veteran of the Germanic campaigns. He is a man of scars and silence. He has seen his friends die in the mud of the Teutoburg forest. He has killed men with his bare hands. He arrives at the villa believing he is there to discuss security or receive orders. Instead, he finds himself in a room that smells of perfume and rot. He is disarmed, literally stripped of his gladius, the symbol of his profession. Messalina does not want his advice. She wants his submission. The degradation of the military class within the villa was specific and psychological. She forced these men of war into scenarios that stripped them of their masculinity. They were compelled to dress in women's robes. They were ordered to serve wine to freedmen, former slaves, who now held more power than they did. They were forced to watch as their rivals, men they had fought alongside or against, whispered their secrets into the ears of the empress. But the worst was the sexual humiliation. To a Roman man, to be the passive partner, to be used, was the ultimate loss of status. It was to be reduced to the level of a slave or a boy. Messalina, understanding this cultural trigger perfectly, orchestrated encounters where generals were forced into passivity. She made them powerless in the one act where a man feels most vulnerable. There is a chilling anecdote that has survived in the margins of history, a quote attributed to a soldier who managed to escape the villa's orbit, perhaps after Messalina's fall. When asked about his time in the Empress circle, he didn't speak of the luxury or the women. He stared into the distance, his face a mask of haunted stone, and said, "Blood dries. Shame never does." He explained that he had survived combat that killed his brothers. He had taken wounds that left him scarred for life. Yet, the memory of what he had been forced to endure in the Empress chambers, the giggling of the courtiers, the cold eyes of Messalina watching him being degraded haunted him more deeply than any battlefield nightmare. In war, there is honor in survival. In the villa, survival required the death of the soul. This cruelty was a strategic error of massive proportions. Messalina treated the soldiers like she treated the senators as soft men who could be bullied. She forgot that these were men trained to kill. She forgot that their loyalty was to the eagle, the standard of the legion, and to the emperor who represented the state, not to the emperor's wife. In the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, and in the distant camps on the Rhine and the Danube, the whispers began to change. They stopped being lewd jokes about the Empress' appetite. They became angry. She mocks the uniform. A centurion would growl over a fire. She treats the legate like a whore. A soldier would spit. The respect for the imperial family was eroding. The soldiers looked at Claudius and saw a cuckold, a weakling who couldn't control his own house. How could such a man command the armies of Rome? If the emperor was a joke, then the empire was a joke, and soldiers do not die for a joke. Messalina had sown a dangerous seed. Contempt. The legions had tolerated Caligula because he was the son of Germanicus, their beloved hero. They tolerated Claudius because he paid them well, but Messalina offered them nothing but humiliation. She was turning the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect her, into a cage of tigers that she was poking with a stick. She didn't see the danger. She saw fear in their eyes and mistook it for submission. She thought that because a general trembled before her in the bedroom, he would tremble before her on the battlefield. She didn't understand that he was trembling with a rage that was being compressed, tighter and tighter, until it became explosive. The soldier's nightmare was not just personal trauma for the men involved. It was a destabilization of the state's monopoly on violence. When the men who hold the swords stop respecting the hand that guides them, the coup is already halfway done. Messalina was busy counting her gold and her secrets, unaware that the iron foundation of Rome was beginning to crack beneath her feet. By the year 42 CE, the subtle rot had become a public spectacle. The whispers of the Subura and the secrets of the villa were no longer enough to feed Messalina's hunger for dominance. She needed to escalate. She needed to bring her private corruption out into the open, to force the entire city of Rome to participate in her psychodrama. She turned to religion. In Rome, religion was not just a matter of faith. It was the glue of the state. The rituals, the festivals, the sacrifices, these were the heartbeat of public life. To mock the gods was to invite disaster. But Messalina saw the gods as just another set of characters in her play. She hijacked the festivals. She began to stage gatherings disguised as celebrations of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, or Venus, the goddess of love. These were not the solemn rites of the priesthood. They were carnivals of excess held in the gardens of the palace, under the open sky, where the smoke of incense mingled with the screams of revelry. The invitation list was a roll call of the surviving nobility. But unlike the villa, where the entrapment was private, here the humiliation was public. The script sets the scene. Incense climbed toward the gods. Priests offered prayers. Then gradually the atmosphere would shift. Imagine the transition. The sun sets. The torches are lit. The drums begin a rhythmic, hypnotic beat. The wine, spiked with herbs and aphrodisiacs, flows freely. Messalina appears, not in the robes of an empress, but dressed as a Maenad, a follower of Bacchus with a panther skin draped over one shoulder and her hair wild and loose. She carries the thyrsus, the staff of the god, but she wields it like a whip. She commands the ceremony to slide into a staged orgy. But orgy is too chaotic a word for what she engineered. This was a ritual of Venus, and rituals have rules. She orchestrated every moment like a maestro conducting an orchestra. She paired people deliberately to maximize the psychological damage. She would command a senator to couple with his bitter political rival's wife, while both husbands watched. She would force a distinguished matron, a woman known for her piety, to perform acts with a gladiator in the center of the circle, illuminated by torchlight. The cruelty was in the watching. In the villa, the shame was hidden in a room. Here, it was on display. She created a circle of complicity. Everyone was watching everyone else fall. Refusal meant disaster. Quote, the account reminds us, not minor social consequences, but genuine ruin. If a guest tried to leave, the Praetorian guards blocking the exits would gently but firmly guide them back. The Empress is not finished, they would say. If a guest refused to participate, Messalina would stop the music. The silence would be deafening. She would stare at the refuser. Does the senator find the rites of Bacchus distasteful? She would ask. Does he believe himself more virtuous than the emperor's wife? To say yes was treason. So, they said no. They drank the wine. They took off their togas. They stepped into the circle. And with every step, a piece of Rome died. The psychological breaking point for the Roman nobility occurred in these gardens. They realized that there was no law anymore. The mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was dead. There was only the whim of Messalina. She was conducting a massive experiment in desensitization. She was breaking the collective will of the ruling class. By forcing them to violate their deepest taboos in public, she bound them to her. Who could they complain to? The gods? She was mocking the gods. The emperor? He was often there, sitting in a drunken stupor, smiling vaguely at the festivities, unaware of the horror in the eyes of his subjects. The most disturbing aspect was the sound. Accounts describe these nights not as joyful, but as frantic. The laughter was too loud, bordering on hysteria. The screams were of pleasure, yes, but also of panic. It was the sound of people drowning in sensation to avoid thinking about what they were becoming. Messalina stood at the center of this vortex, untouched. She was the eye of the storm. She didn't always participate in the frantic coupling around her. Sometimes she just watched, sipping from a golden cup, her eyes scanning the crowd. She looked like a goddess of chaos, satisfied with the destruction of order. She had achieved total control. She controlled their bodies through lust, their fortunes through greed, and their souls through shame. The Roman social hierarchy, which had stood for centuries, was now a pile of rubble in her garden, and she was dancing on top of it. But in her arrogance, she forgot that even gods can bleed. By desecrating the rituals, she wasn't just offending men. She was offending the superstitious heart of the people. The commoners, who didn't attend these parties but heard the stories, began to mutter. They believed that such impiety would bring a curse. They looked at the sky, waiting for the lightning. Messalina didn't fear the lightning. She was too busy preparing for her greatest performance, yet a contest that would strip away the last pretense of her being an empress and reveal the raw, insatiable creature beneath. The most disturbing accounts from this dark period focus less on the public displays of the festivals and more on a specific, singular event that revealed the depths of Messalina's pathology. It wasn't enough to control the nobility through fear. It wasn't enough to debase the generals. She possessed a gnawing, insatiable need to compete. She treated sex not as an act of pleasure or even connection, but as a gladiator treats combat, as a zero-sum game where there had to be a winner and a loser, and where victory meant proving yourself physically superior to every other living being. Her most infamous contest, the endurance match against Scylla, often referred to in historical texts as the most celebrated prostitute in Rome, shocked even the jaded capital. It is a story recorded by Pliny the Elder, a historian known for his obsession with facts, which suggests this was not merely a rumor, but a witnessed event that entered the annals of Roman history as a moment of absolute absurdity. The setup was cold, clinical, and terrifying. Messalina did not summon Scylla to the palace to have her executed or arrested. She summoned her as a rival. Scylla was a legend in the Subra, a woman who had built a reputation across Rome for her beauty, her skill, and her legendary physical stamina. She was the queen of the night in the lower city. Messalina, the queen of the world on the Palatine, felt threatened. She couldn't abide the idea that a common whore might be better at anything than the Empress of Rome. The contest was held in a private wing of the palace, before a select audience of nobles and trusted courtiers. This was not a chaotic orgy. The atmosphere was closer to a sporting event or a medical experiment. There were scorekeepers. There were witnesses. The air was thick with a tension that was almost electric. Scylla arrived, likely terrified and confused. To be summoned by the Empress usually meant death. But when the terms were explained, a challenge to see who could satisfy more men in a single night, she realized she was fighting for her life in a different way. If she won, she might humiliate the Empress and die. If she lost, she might be spared. The duel of flesh began at dusk. Scylla, a professional who understood the limits of the human body, paced herself carefully through the long hours. She treated the act with the efficiency of a tradeswoman. She tended to the line of volunteers, men chosen for their vigor one after another. The original script notes, she tended to 25 men through the long hours, until exhaustion finally took her. By the time the sun began to bleed into the sky, Scylla was broken. She had pushed her body beyond the limits of endurance. She collapsed, weeping and exhausted, unable to continue. In the eyes of any sane observer, she had performed a Herculean feat. She had set a standard that seemed impossible. Everyone in the room believed the contest was over. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat and lamp oil. The scorekeepers prepared to tally the results. Everyone assumed Messalina would acknowledge Scylla's effort, perhaps claim a draw, or graciously accept a victory by default as Scylla yielded. But the Empress didn't stop. This is the moment where the story shifts from scandal to horror. Messalina refused to yield. She looked at the collapsed form of Scylla with cold contempt. She wasn't just competing with the woman. She was competing with biology itself. She continued past 30 men, the accounts tell us. She pushed beyond physical exhaustion, driven by something that wasn't lust. It was a terrifying will to power. It was about proving a point that she could exceed even the professionals, that there was no limit to her, that she was fundamentally different from and superior to every other woman in Rome. She continued until no volunteers remained. She continued until there was literally no one left to conquer. By dawn, the Empress of Rome had won her victory. She stood shaking, perhaps, but standing while her rival lay defeated on the floor. She had turned herself into a spectacle, reigning in degradation not as disgrace, but as triumph. The nobles who witnessed it sat in horrified silence. They had seen many things in Rome: executions, beast hunts, gladiatorial slaughters, but they had never seen this. This wasn't the behavior of an empress. This wasn't the conduct of a matrona. This was something else entirely. It was a violation of every notion Rome held about gender, power, and respectability. It was the behavior of a beast in the skin of a goddess. And yet, she had made it work. She had made her degradation into a demonstration of absolute power. She looked at the senators in the room, her eyes burning with a dark fire, and dared them to speak, dared them to judge her. In that silence, a terrifying message was communicated. I can do the lowest thing imaginable, and I am still your master. I can out-whore the whore, and you must still bow to me. Why? Why would a woman raised in privilege, adored for beauty, and crowned as empress, deliberately embrace degradation as her highest pleasure? Historians and psychologists have searched for answers across the centuries. Some argue it was insatiable lust, a condition the Romans called uterine fury, an appetite that could never be satisfied no matter how many times it was indulged. They paint her as a victim of her own biology, a nymphomaniac driven by chemical imbalances. Others point to a hunger for power. In a world where women were legally property, where they were traded like cattle in marriage alliances, sex was the only currency Messalina controlled completely. Controlling men through sex, taking their dignity, their secrets, their seed was the deepest form of dominion. Every man she used was a conquest, a small war won in the bedroom. Some modern scholars see trauma in her story. She was married off at 15 to a man more than twice her age. A man whose body was failing, whose mind was sometimes uncertain, whose authority was absolute. In marrying Claudius, she lost autonomy completely. Everything about her was controlled. What she wore, where she went, who she could speak to. Perhaps in her secret nights, in her orchestration of humiliation, she was reclaiming the only power available to her, the power of her own body, used on her own terms. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more chilling. For Messalina, the contrast was the drug. The gap between who she was supposed to be and who she actually was created a kind of psychological electricity that drove her forward. She was living two completely separate lives, and the danger of the secret, the constant risk of discovery, may have been more addictive than any physical pleasure. Regardless of the why, the result was undeniable. She had won the duel. Scylla was carried out, broken and forgotten by history. Messalina remained. But in winning, she had lost something vital. She had destroyed the last vestige of the illusion. The people in that room could no longer look at her and see the Empress. They saw a monster. And monsters, in the Roman mind, are things to be hunted. The victory over Scylla was the peak of her physical excess, but it was also the beginning of her political end. She had pushed too far. She had revealed too much. The fear in the room was beginning to curdle into disgust, and disgust is the one emotion that can overcome fear. Messalina stood triumphant in the dawn light, but the long shadows were already reaching for her throat. The hangover from Messalina's reign was not merely physical, it was administrative. The empire was beginning to stall. Rome was a machine that required constant maintenance. Decisions needed to be made, laws enforced, provinces managed, but the machinery was rusting from the inside, gummed up by the sticky residue of the Empress' empire of lust. The consequences of her lifestyle rippled outward from the bedroom to the farthest frontiers. The Senate, the deliberative body that was supposed to guide the state, found itself frozen. How could a senator debate a law on public morality when he knew the Empress had a file on his own perversions? How could the consuls propose measures to curb luxury when they had just spent the night at a banquet where wine flowed like water and gold was thrown to dancers? Blackmail is a powerful tool for control, but it is a terrible tool for governance. It breeds paralysis. Governors were chosen not for ability, but for vulnerability. We can imagine the chaos in the provinces. A competent administrator in Gaul might be recalled and replaced by one of Messalina's favorites, a man who had no idea how to manage a tax revolt but knew exactly how to please the Empress. In Judea, in Syria, in Egypt, the quality of Roman rule began to degrade. Corruption flourished because the men at the top were corrupt. If the governor is stealing to pay the Empress, the tax collector will steal to pay the governor, and the soldier will steal to pay the tax collector. The rot trickled down. Foreign envoys, men with sharp eyes and few loyalties, began to notice. Diplomats from Parthia, tribal chieftains from Germania, and emissaries from the client kingdoms of the East came to Rome to conduct business. They expected to find the iron-willed masters of the world. Instead, they reported back to their kings that something strange was happening. Senators who should have been sharp and engaged seemed subdued, distracted, almost broken. The script tells us. Imagine a Parthian ambassador sitting across from a Roman senator. The Parthian is negotiating a border treaty. He expects a hard fight. Instead, he finds the Roman oddly reluctant, his eyes darting around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. The Roman agrees to unfavorable terms quickly. Why? Because he is terrified that if he stays in the negotiation too long, a messenger from Messalina will arrive. He is not thinking about the border. He is thinking about the secret she holds over him. The envoys sensed weakness. The machinery of the empire was beginning to rust from the inside. They sent messages home. Rome is distracted. Rome is eating itself. Now might be the time to push. Messalina, in her bubble of indulgence, was blind to this geopolitical damage. But she was not blind to the atmosphere in the palace. She could feel the change in the air. The adoration of the crowds was becoming thinner. The cheers were forced. The eyes of the servants were no longer lowered in respect but averted in fear, or worse, judgment. Decadence breeds enemies. This is a law as old as civilization itself. The soldiers were the first to turn. We have explored the humiliation of the generals, but the rank and file were equally dangerous. These were men who lived by a code. They had tolerated imperial excess before Augustus lived well. Tiberius had his island, but this was different. This was shameful. Rumors spread in the barracks that their own commanders had been stripped of dignity. For men hardened by war, seeing their leaders humiliated was worse than seeing them killed. It broke the chain of command. If the general is a coward who bows to a woman's whims, why should the legionary follow him into battle? The muttering grew louder. The barracks rang with whispers and curses that elsewhere would have meant treason. They called her names that would have resulted in execution. They spat when her litter passed. The foundation of her power, the fear she inspired, was shifting. It was turning into hatred. Messalina felt the ground shaking. Her reaction was typical of a tyrant. Paranoia. She didn't change her behavior. She tightened her grip. She increased the number of guards around her, unaware that the guards themselves despised her. She demanded harsher punishments for any hint of disloyalty. If a poet wrote a satire that seemed to mock her, he was exiled. If a courtier failed to smile at her jokes, he was banished. The spectacles turned cruel, as if doubling the shame could somehow strangle rebellion in its cradle. She was in a spiral. To feel safe, She needed to control everyone. To control everyone, she needed more secrets. To get more secrets, she needed more debauchery. It was a self-defeating loop. Each act cut new cracks into the fragile facade of her dominion. The question began to form in the minds of the survivors. How long? Rome had survived fire, plague, and civil war. But could it survive an empress who ruled through degradation? Could the structure of the empire withstand the weight of her corruption? These questions were no longer whispers. They were being asked in deliberate conversations behind closed doors. Powerful men, the freedman Narcissus, the advisor palace men who had effectively run the empire for Claudius, began to look at Messalina not as a partner, but as a cancer. They realized that she was going to kill the host. If Messalina wasn't stopped, she would bring down the dynasty. The breaking point was approaching. The tension in Rome in 48 CE was palpable. It was the calm before the storm. Messalina, driven by her demons, was about to make a mistake so colossal, so reckless, that it would force the hand of fate. She was about to cross the final line. She was about to commit an act that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be blackmailed away, and couldn't be survived. She was about to get married. The year was 48 CE. The autumn winds were beginning to cool the streets of Rome, but the fever in the palace was reaching its peak. What happened next is an event so bold, so reckless, that it still staggers historians more than 19 centuries later. It defies political logic. It defies self-preservation. It is the moment where Messalina's story crosses from tyranny into madness. Claudius, the emperor, had left Rome. He had traveled to Ostia, the port city, to oversee the grain shipments and attend to religious duties. The cat was away, and the mouse decided not just to play, but to burn the house down. Messalina staged a wedding. This was not a secret tryst in the darkness. It wasn't a private oath exchanged between lovers in a hidden room. It wasn't a play act for one of her festivals. It was a full, legal, formal Roman marriage ceremony. Her groom was Gaius Silius. He was a senator designate, young, incredibly handsome, and foolishly ambitious. He had been her lover for some time. She had forced him to divorce his wife to be with her. But being a lover was no longer enough for Messalina. She wanted the ritual. She wanted the title. The scene described by the ancient sources is surreal. The ceremony was conducted in the gardens, likely the very gardens she had stolen from Valerius Asiaticus. It was broad daylight. Guests were invited, senators, knights, members of the court. They arrived, perhaps confused, perhaps terrified, but they came. Every element that a real marriage demanded stood in place to legitimize the union. The Flamen, the priest of Jupiter, was there, or at least someone playing the role convincingly. The auspices were taken, the flight of birds was read, the marriage contract, the tabulae nuptials, was signed and sealed by witnesses. Messalina wore the flamium, the bright orange bridal veil. She wore the saffron shoes. She stood before the altar, held hands with Silius, and spoke the sacred vows. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. She was now married to Gaius Silius. The problem, of course, was that she was already married to the Emperor of Rome. This was not mere scandal. It was bigamy. It was blasphemy. But most importantly, in the eyes of Roman law, it was treason. By marrying Silius, a man of noble blood, she was effectively declaring that Claudius was no longer her husband. And if Claudius was no longer her husband, he was likely no longer the emperor in her eyes. She was positioning Silius as the new princeps, the new Caesar. It was an open revolt. She stepped out of the shadow into the daylight. Her lust transformed into a coup d'etat. What could have driven her to such madness? Did she believe that Claudius would simply submit? Did she think the old man was so weak, so doting, that he would accept a ménage à trois on the throne? Did she believe that the Senate would yield to her will? Or did she think the web of blackmail she had spun was so strong that no one would dare to tell him? Some historians suggest a more calculated motive. They argue that Messalina feared Claudius was dying or about to be overthrown, and she was preemptively securing a new protector for herself and her son, Britannicus. Silius would be the regent, the stepfather, who would hold the throne until the boy came of age. Others see it as the ultimate expression of the compulsion, the need to escalate, the addiction to risk. She had done everything else. She had been a whore, a tyrant, a goddess. The only thing left was to break the ultimate law, the sanctity of the imperial marriage itself. Was she simply unable to stop, driven forward by a hunger that could only be satisfied by greater and greater acts of transgression? Whatever the motive, The act proved fatal. The wedding party continued into the night. It was a scene of delirious excess. A vintage harvest festival was staged. Vats of wine were trampled. Silius, dressed in ivy, played the role of Bacchus. Messalina, again the Maenad, danced with flowing hair. The guests, realizing the magnitude of what they were witnessing, partied with the frantic energy of people on the Titanic. They knew the ship was sinking. But while the wine flowed in Rome, the news traveled to Ostia. The system Messalina had built, the network of spies and informants, finally turned against her. Or rather, the men she hadn't managed to break finally made their move. The freedmen of the Emperor Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus were the real power behind the throne. They hated Messalina. They feared her influence, and they saw this wedding not just as a scandal, but as a direct threat to their lives. If Silius became emperor, they would be the first to die. Narcissus took charge. He didn't trust the rumor mill. He ensured the information reached Claudius directly, and he framed it in the only way that would wake the emperor up, not as a moral failing, but as a lethal threat. Silius wants your throne, they told him. He is already acting as Caesar. The soldiers are confused. If you do not act, you will be dead by morning. At first, the emperor laughed. Surely it was a wild rumor? An exaggeration? Even Messalina couldn't be mad enough to marry someone else. It seemed impossible. But as proof accumulated, as witnesses were produced and the details of the contracts were revealed, the laughter died. Claudius, the man who had been mocked, cuckolded, and managed, finally felt the cold steel of reality. His authority had been undermined. His legitimacy was challenged. The mask of the doting husband crumbled, revealing the terrified autocrat beneath. He hesitated. He was a man who always hesitated, but Narcissus pushed him. Go to Rome, the freedman urged. Go to the Praetorian camp. Secure the guard. If the guard is yours, the city is yours. Claudius returned to Rome, but he didn't come as a husband. He came with soldiers at his back. He came as Caesar. The party in the gardens was about to end. The music was fading, and in the distance, the rhythmic thud of marching boots could be heard on the Via Appia. The party ended not with a toast, but with a rumor that swept through the gardens like a cold wind. Claudius is coming. The effect was instantaneous. The music stopped. The dancers froze. The guests, who moments before had been celebrating the new power couple, scattered like cockroaches when a torch is lit. Senators ripped off their garlands and ran for the exits. Silius, the groom who would be emperor, slipped away to the forum to pretend he was working. A pathetic attempt to hide from the avalanche. Messalina was left alone. For the first time in a decade, her power evaporated. She tried to move through the city, to go to meet Claudius on the road, to work her old magic. She believed that if she could just see him, if she could just look into his eyes and weep, he would forgive her. He always had. She was the mother of his children. She was his little Val. But the city had turned against her. No chariot waited for her. No litter bearers offered their shoulders. In a final, stinging indignity, the Empress of Rome was forced to walk through the streets, eventually hitching a ride on a cart used to haul garden refuse. The woman who had worn the spoils of the empire was now riding amidst the trash. She reached the outskirts of the city, meeting Claudius' carriage on the road. She screamed out to him, "Hear the mother of Britannicus! Hear your Octavia!" She tried to invoke the children, the ultimate shield. But Narcissus, the freedman who was now acting as the emperor's brain, would not let her speak. He shouted over her, reciting a list of her crimes, handing Claudius scrolls detailing her affairs. He kept the emperor's gaze focused forward, away from the weeping woman in the dust. The carriage rolled past her. The door had closed. Messalina retreated to the gardens of Lucullus, the very place she had stolen, the place where she had staged her treasonous wedding. It was fitting that she would end there. The garden was silent now. The wine vats were overturned. The garlands were wilting. She was found there by the soldiers. Not the Praetorian guard who had once protected her vice, but a tribune sent by Narcissus with a specific order: execution. Messalina was with her mother, Domitia Lepida. They had been estranged for years. Messalina's depravity had horrified the older woman, but in the end, a mother is a mother. Domitia sat with her daughter in the dirt. She offered the only advice left. "Life is over," she said. "All that remains is to make a decent end." She handed Messalina a dagger. The implication was clear: suicide. It was the Roman way. To die by one's own hand was to reclaim a shred of dignity. Messalina took the blade. She held it to her throat. She tried to press it to her chest, but she couldn't do it. The will that had broken senators, the ferocity that had outlasted Scylla, it was gone. She was just a 8-year-old girl, terrified of the dark. She sobbed. She trembled. The blade slipped from her shaking fingers. She faltered. She couldn't follow through. The tribune, impatient and disgusted, didn't wait. He drew his sword. With a single, brutal thrust, he ran her through. The empress, who had enslaved Rome through shame, died not in grandeur, not with the dignity of a queen, but in panic and blood. Crying in her mother's arms. She died begging. She died afraid. She died discovering that the power she had wielded so completely was not absolute after all. Claudius was at dinner when they told him, "Messalina is dead," the messenger said. The emperor did not ask how. He did not weep. He stared at his cup for a moment, then signaled to the slave. "Pour more wine," he said. He never spoke her name again. The aftermath was a systematic erasure. The Senate ordered a damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was the ultimate Roman punishment. Her statues were toppled and smashed. Her name was chiseled off every inscription, every monument, every coin. She was to be forgotten. But Rome never forgot. The more they tried to bury her, the louder her legend grew. She became a cautionary tale, a monster of myth, the Whore Empress. Stand in the Palatine ruins today. The silence feels heavy. Visitors admire the mosaics and the engineering that has defied the centuries. But beneath the dust, the stones murmur of something darker. They whisper of the brothel hidden in plain sight. They echo with the screams of the festivals. They remember the woman who nearly brought the greatest empire in history to its knees, not with armies, but with the deliberate wielding of her own shame. Messalina's story is a warning carved across time. It reminds us that empires do not only fall to invasion, they do not crumble only when barbarians breach the walls. They collapse from the rot within. They fall when the people in power lose their fear of judgment. Messalina proved that lust can be as destructive as steel. She showed that the most dangerous weapon is not the sword, but the secret. And she left us with a question that still chills the blood. What happens when the one chosen to embody virtue crowns herself with vice? Thank you for watching this journey into the darkest corners of Roman history. If this story captivated you, please like and subscribe to Quiet Historians. We have many more stories of the hidden history of the ancient world coming soon. Click the bell icon so you never miss an upload. And tell me in the comments, do you think Messalina was a monster or a victim of a monstrous system? I read every comment. Until next time, keep looking beneath the marble.